You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
I've been working in the music industry my entire life. I've worked within kind of music and public policy for 15 years, trying to get governments and the private sector to recognize the potential of music as an economic tool. We essentially created a model that estimated how much money would be collected in the country if it had functioning systems. Nigeria is at present the 55th largest music economy by income. It should be, I think, in the top 10, let alone I think it should be in the top 5.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to another episode of the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we explore the ideas, innovations, and strategies that are unlocking Africa's economic potential. While the global recorded music market is worth $47.5 billion, Africa's creators are structurally locked out of their fair share because behind every hit song lies an economic system involving copyright, royalties, publishing, licensing, investment, and regulation. And according to new research from the Music Economy Development Initiative, those systems remain so undeveloped, hundreds of millions of dollars are going uncollected in just Nigeria and Kenya alone, while Africa contributes less than 1% of global music copyright revenues, despite producing some of the world's fastest growing music markets. Today, we're joined by someone trying to change that. Shain Shapiro is founder and executive director of the Center for Music Ecosystems and one of the architects behind the Music Economy Development Initiative, a global partnership welcome to help governments, investors, and policymakers understand music not simply as culture, but as economic infrastructure capable of creating jobs, attracting investment, and driving long-term development. Shain, welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast. How are you?
I'm well. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. As always, I like to start from the beginning, so I was hoping you can give us a nice brief introduction into who Shain Shapiro is.
Of course. So I've been working in the music industry my entire life. I'm Canadian, but I live in the UK. I've worked within kind of music and public policy for 15 years, really trying to get governments and the private sector to recognize the potential of music as an economic tool in one way or another. And in addition to running the Center for Music Ecosystems, I founded and am chair of a consulting company called Sound Diplomacy, where we work on music and creative economy and economic policy and strategy all over the world. So I've been doing this for a long time. Obviously, I'm incredibly passionate about music. This is the only real job I've ever had from my entire life. It was not I didn't plan it this way, but this is the way that it's happened. And I just feel that music is this incredible superpower that we are not utilizing. And that's what really led to creating this.
Fantastic. And what a fantastic job it is, and what a fantastic job you're doing. And as you said, most people think of music as just entertainment or culture, and you argue that governments should think of it as economic infrastructure. So what fundamentally changes, would you say, when policymakers adopt that mindset?
Yeah, well, music is entertainment, obviously. Music is whatever the listener wants it to be. I don't want to get away from that. Music is this incredible thing that influences how we think, how we dress, how we act, where we live, all these kinds of things, right? It's the thing we invite into our most intimate moments. And I always say, who here has been to a wedding or a funeral without music, right? I don't want to take away from that. That's really important, but music is also an economy like anything else. And anytime music is listened to somewhere in the world, someone who is responsible for making that music should be paid. And I think that music is one of these economies that is just wholly misunderstood by governments, especially governments in Africa, where there seems to be a bit of a disconnect to recognize the economic potential that music can have to solve a lot of problems and challenges that exist around youth employment, around skills development, around poverty. instead of just being entertainment, right? So you can do both. And what fundamentally changes is the recognition that music is a economic supply chain like anything else, and that economic supply chain requires the right policies and strategies and legal frameworks and so on to be successful. And when a government implements those rules, and those policies that allows music to make money, essentially, then you'd be surprised how significant that money can be, because of, the fact that everyone is listening to music all the time.
So I've gone through the report that you generated and looking for some of the key phrases or lines. I stumbled against what matters most is measured least. Why do you believe music has remained largely, invisible in the African economic policy discussions, despite, as you say, having enormous cultural influence and economic potential?
Yeah, I didn't come up with that. I have to give that to my co-author of one of the reports that we wrote, and a music economist named Will Page. That was his line, what matters the most is what's measured least. And I wish I wrote that. But what we mean by that, again, is in every African country, I feel music has cultural, tribal, religious, community benefits and values. And without those things, right, it impacts the success of a particular community. Music is literally the soundtrack to life. But we're not really measuring that because it's there, right? I call it kind of the ignorance of ubiquity. Is music is there already, music is impacting people's lives, music is available, but we tend not to truly measure, especially the economic potential that music being there has. So because music is literally everywhere all the time, and you have access to every song ever written by anyone in history on your mobile phone in most countries, that means we don't recognize the systems and the structures that can optimize the potential of music. So most countries have no idea how much music is worth. Most countries have no idea how much music is being listened to. Most countries have no idea how many artists are in the country, how many venues, how many songs are written. But at the same time, I would argue that everyone, or most people, recognize how important music is. So what I'm trying to do is bring the two sides together. I want people to experience music in whatever way they want. But I think that there's a huge opportunity, especially in Africa, to leverage the history, the creativity, the demography, to use music as an economic superpower.
So if we keep on the theme of measurement and measuring Africa's hidden music economy, I know your research found almost $286 million in recorded music revenue could be captured in just Nigeria and Kenya alone. So how did you arrive at that figure?
Yeah, so what we've tried to do, so this is just recorded music, so this doesn't include live music, so the amount of money is probably much higher than that. But what we did is we essentially created a model that estimated how much money would be collected in the country if it had functioning systems to collect the money. So when someone listens to a song on Boomplay or Medundu or Spotify or whatever, a royalty is generated. That royalty then goes through a system to reach the person who owns that royalty. Those systems tend not to exist or are not optimized or efficient in Nigeria or Kenya. So we created an economic model that estimated if those systems existed, how much money would be collected. So this is money that is being generated. So the $286 million is music that will be listened to next year in Nigeria and Kenya. So that money will be generated in Nigeria and Kenya. It just won't be collected in Nigeria and Kenya. The money will leave. That's the problem. It's not that the money doesn't exist. It's going to happen because we know how much music is going to be listened to. We can estimate that. The issue is the fact that the money does not stay in the country. So just to add on to that, Africa, as we say, 18% of the world's population, but 0.3%, just think about that, of total recorded music revenue, right? So that is not circling the square. And how much African music is being listened to around the world right now. And I would argue more than 0.3% of the total music that's being listened to. So there's a huge disconnect. It's not about talent. It's not about drive. It's not about creativity. It's about systems and processes and policy.
So when you went on this journey of collecting the data, what would you say surprised you most when gathering the data?
The amount didn't surprise me. And again, this is just 2 countries. There's lots of estimations about how much the music economy should be worth. We're trying to produce the most accurate forecasts we possibly can. What surprised me is actually more when we launched the data, that the interest that we've received in trying to fix the problem. So we have had governments reach out and saying, we have to fix this. And there's a lot of good news. I know we'll talk about that. The direction of travel in this context is very positive, not in every country, but in general. So the drive to fix the problem has been very encouraging, but music is quite complicated in terms of how it makes money and how money flows within the supply chain of music. So another thing that kind of surprised me is really the lack of knowledge from economic policymakers at its most basic level of how music works. So that's my job. My job is to try to be the translator and the educator. And I should stop assuming, because that's my problem. And what I've learned is we really have to do a much better job, not just at explaining the opportunity, but this is a problem that can be solved. It could be solved tomorrow if we wanted it to. Seriously.
Oh, wow. So as you mentioned, governments and other kind of key stakeholders have reached out and want to resolve the problem or the disconnect. But if we take a few steps back, how does such a large disconnect happen in the first place?
That's a big question. I think there's historical reasons for this, that have to do with race, class, colonialism, all of these things that I wish were in the past but are not. There's also there's a history of not treating the creative industries as a serious industry. I think that is changing, especially in film. But music is something we do after work, right? It's not work for most people. So there is a historical way of thinking that is going to take time to change, to say, listen, this is serious and it can also be fun at the same time. And I don't think that has been really ingrained, especially because of the cultural power of music across African countries and societies and tribes and communities. So I think that, there are many reasons. But really, it's just because we haven't really thought of it this way. And we haven't thought of it this way in a way that explains that, this is not a solution that can be imported in. This has to happen on the ground in every country, led by local people. And I think that agency and that opportunity is what is, I think, accelerating the drive to change. That's one thing that excites me the most, is that I think the future of the global music industry is in Africa. As you know, you look at me, I am not African, this is my musical passion. Why I came to this, maybe I should tell you, is many of my favorite artists are from the continent, and really where I really learned about why I love music so much came from artists from the continent, and I think that this truly is a potential for a seismic economic sea change in every country if we just recognize it and work together to change it.
So if we look at it in terms of specific countries, is there a specific country or countries that maybe surprised you the most during the research?
The data portal really is aimed at, policymakers and investors and development banks and people like that who need to have a framework to understand how music works. And, certainly I think simply because of demography and the amount of people, I think the greatest opportunity is in Nigeria. There's a lot more people there. right? But the amount of Nigerian music that has become kind of a musical lingua franca of the world, the investments that are being made in the market by the private sector, the record labels, and so on, and the government has made some significant strides in trying to address some of the systemic problems that have occurred in Nigeria over the last several decades. So I think that that's one of the countries I'm most excited about, and I think has the most potential. I think you can say the same thing of really, I don't think there is a country, even countries that are undergoing conflict or other external issues, there's still opportunity in music. That's one of the beautiful things about music is if you own the track and it gets listened to anywhere, you should get paid regardless of what is happening in your day to day. And so I think there's opportunities really everywhere. But we're seeing governments like Rwanda has taken some positive strides. Ghana has taken positive strides. Even Uganda, Mozambique, there are, but it's still kind of baby steps, I would argue, in terms of what needs to happen to really capitalize on this opportunity.
I guess for me, the question is why, if we take the example of Nigeria, we know that Nigerian artists are dominating global charts. So where exactly is the value leaking out? Is it piracy, copyright systems?
I'll explain it, and I'll try to explain this as simply as I possibly can. So when you record a song or you write a song, right, the song is made up of a series of copyrights of intellectual property, right, that is owned by people who made it. And there's different types of copyright that you can own, whether you write the song or you play on the song or so on. So when you do that, like a ship, right, that is traveling in the world, a song has to be registered somewhere. It has to have a domiciled country registration. So the money has to flow to somewhere. Nigeria doesn't have an efficient system at present to register these copyrights. So what happens is these artists that are very successful and well-known, they will essentially non-domicile themselves. They will become, in essence, an offshore company because they will have to register their copyrights abroad in the UK, the US, France, whatever. That means that anytime their music is listened to, the money goes to the UK, US, or France first, and then some of it comes back to Nigeria. Instead of, if there was a system to properly administer and register these copyrights in Nigeria, it would start in Nigeria and then go out. So what we're seeing is a reversal of what should happen. So we are creating kind of a remittance economy based around music rather than a domicile economy. And when the money has to be essentially registered somewhere else first or captured somewhere else first, that obviously reduces the tax implications of that revenue generation in Nigeria. So it makes it harder to recognize that this money has been made in Nigeria, despite the artist is Nigerian. The song was recorded in Nigeria, right? But if it was registered in the UK, from an IP perspective, the song is British, not Nigerian. That's what needs to change. Is that and that is based around copyright management organizations and legal frameworks, which are on the surface very complicated. But these systems function in many other countries, and it's a fixable problem. It's more about a will to fix it, right? And then the other side of it is enforcement, is that when people listen to music, someone has to pay for it. I'm not saying that's piracy in the most traditional sense. Often the systems to be able to pay for it do not exist or are inefficient. So we need a system and we need a general population to see music as a benefit, not as a cost, and want to pay for it. And that requires transparency, efficiency, regulation. So together, we end up having these incredible global successes that are Nigerian, but are also not Nigerian. Yes. And that's what we want to change, right? We don't want someone to have to become an offshore company just to be able to function as a company. That doesn't make sense, but that's what happens in music. And that's what we need to change.
Interesting. I guess that explains one of the analogies I've seen throughout the report. It says Africa needs to build the train tracks before it can run the train. So it explains in terms of what a functioning music economy actually requires beyond talented artists. So if a government genuinely wants to build that world-class music economy, say over the next decade, what would you say is the fundamental building blocks, or where should they start from?
The first is intent, and that comes from leadership. And there's lots of governments that have done this, which is incredibly encouraging, Nigeria being one. You have to state that it matters. Simple, right? If you say, and the leaders of the country say, listen, this matters, and this is how it matters, that is really important. I can't stress how important that is, because that is how you can unlock access to finance, which we don't talk about, right? Is how do you actually build the tracks, right? You need money to build the tracks, but you can only generate investment and capitalization if people want it. And that comes with leadership, that comes with intent. That's one. Two is the systems to administer music in this way, recorded music in this way, they exist. There are many, many different ways to do it. And, a country just has to build a system or refine a system or reimagine a system that works for them. And I can't get into too many specifics because I don't know what the best system is in Nigeria because I'm not Nigerian and it's not my right to say. But there are, the basics of, again, registration, knowing what is being played where, enforcing those plays so people get paid, and then paying the organization or the writer or whatever who owns the art, who owns the rights. There are many different ways to do that, and they're plug and play. They're kind of off the shelf, so you don't need to create anything new. You just need the government to invest in it and to do it in an efficient and transparent way. And then we need greater partnerships with development banks and institutional investors who can have a financial stake in the long term, right? Music is a terrific long-term investment. This is why a lot of pension funds have been investing in music rights in North America, right? Buying the rights of Fleetwood Mac or Neil Young or, I don't know, these types of artists, or Pink Floyd, right? Because anytime music is played anywhere, someone gets paid. It's a long-term patient capital investment. And this is why pension funds invest in it. I believe the same argument stands in an African country, where if you're looking at a long-term, stable patient investment over 12 to 15 years, music is a really good one. You just have to have the systems to be able to facilitate the capital flow. That's how we start. We start with intent. We start with some investment in systems, and we go from there.
So as you mentioned, you say Nigeria has done it, or Nigeria has started the process. So where would you say Nigeria is in its journey to building a world-class music economy?
So Nigeria is at present, I think, the 55th largest music economy by income. It should be, I think, in the top 10, let alone I think it should be in the top 5. The Ministry of Culture under Minister Misawa has done a lot of really positive things to reform, frankly, a lot of the boring regulatory stuff that has to be fixed behind the scenes in terms of ensuring that copyrights are paid for and recognizing that money needs to go to rights holders. But policy and obviously things happening on the ground, it takes time. So, the analogy that I like to use is Nigeria is starting to remediate the land and sow the seeds for an amazing garden. And now the plants are starting to sprout through the soil. But now we really need to tend to the garden, and deal with potential pests and so on, so that the plants can grow and thrive. And I think that they're just kind of starting on that. But again, there is a long history here, which I don't want to discount, of amazing people trying to address the problem and addressing the problem in many ways. But I think the intent of the government over the last few years in Nigeria has been far more active and engaged than in the past, and that's something to be celebrated.
I think one thing I found quite interesting is that it approaches it as not simply a policy conversation, more of like a investment conversation. The report even proposes a major investment program to demonstrate music as a development investment. So with that in mind, what would you say success would actually look like if that happened?
I think success would look like a music economy that is worth 5 to 10 times what it is now. Success would look like Nigerian artists being able to function like British artists or American artists in the same way. We'd see significant private sector investment from the record labels and publishers and other companies. We'd see an even more sustainable touring market emerge in Nigeria. It's a country that you can play 30 shows. I still feel there's enough people, there's enough places with the right infrastructure and the right systems. And I think that what the government wanted was that the creative economy would be worth 10% of GDP by 2030. I'm not sure it'll get there, but I truly believe that can be achieved in the not too distant future with music and probably film because of Nollywood and the amazing talent of Nigerian filmmakers and audiovisual artists. I truly believe that the creative economy can get to that point in Nigeria, maybe by 2035, if the systems are in place by 2030.
So if we look beyond musicians themselves, obviously it's quite difficult to do that when you're talking about music. So where would you say are the biggest investment opportunities across the wider music value chain?
Well, music is one of these amazing industries that it influences so many other things just by being there, right? So when you go to a gig in a stadium, you got to eat. A lot of people have to stay in a hotel. You got to get there, whether it's an Uber or public transit. You'll potentially buy some merchandise, So all of these different sectors, transport, logistics, hospitality, tourism, there's significant economic uplift in investing in music for these sectors. And that's both on live and recorded music. As well as I think there's even more opportunities within film and TV and design and architecture and others across Nigeria or other African countries. Music is not, music is the opposite of a vacuum, right? When you're listening to music, you are automatically engaging with other people. Even if you're listening on your own, right? You're listening to something that other people made. And the broader economic supply chain that music has is completely underdeveloped and has extreme, I think, potential uplift. Even in terms of making instruments, in terms of the educational infrastructure that's needed in schools and recording studios and rehearsal spaces and things like that. All of these things will create jobs. All of these things are going to be embedded in communities that service young people. All of these things are technically and should be available to everybody, right? Music doesn't pick sides, and you don't. And yes, a very small percentage of people who make it will be global superstars. But you'd be surprised as well the ancillary benefits, the mental health benefits, the social benefits that engaging with music can have. And, even if we can get the confidence to change in a bunch of young people just by engaging them in music making, think about how that would translate into their other job prospects and career opportunities as they grow. So there's so many different benefits to music. This is what I'm working on right now. I have a new book coming out in February that's all about this. So I've been really focused on writing about the different ways that, music improves society.
And going back to a point you made earlier with regards to Nigeria's capability of potentially being the 5th net exporter of music. So if we look beyond Nigeria, are there any other African markets that you believe have the potential or are quietly building the foundations for the next major music economy?
There's always significant opportunities in South Africa. South Africa is further ahead in terms of its regulatory environment than Nigeria. I also think there's opportunities in Egypt and Morocco, significant opportunities in Kenya and in Ghana. And I think every single country, Côte d'Ivoire, another one that's a country that is generated tons of indigenous music genres that have kind of become part of the popular music lexicon. So maybe I sound a bit over ambitious or overexcited, but I'm just like, think of the opportunity in every single country. Think of all the people who are listening to music right now that could be benefiting more from it. And I think that is true across the continent.
So if we bring the conversation back to current happenings, we can't have a conversation like this without mentioning or discussing the likes of AI, streaming, digital distribution. Mm-hmm. Are these technologies leveling the playing field for African creators, or do they risk increasing the gap?
Well, both. Both. AI is a tool, right? Like any tool, how you use it matters. If you don't have the regulatory infrastructure to protect intellectual property, right, i.e. you can't register it, you can't own it, you can't get paid for it, then AI is just another way to utilize music and not get paid. But there are tons of opportunities that AI, across how music is produced, access to music making for people who may not have traditional music education. But I truly believe it's a bit more fundamental than that. AI is not a savior or an extreme threat. AI, to me, again, is something that we have to engage with and deal with as a tool that human beings control. And it starts with understanding how it works, understanding what it is, and building the right regulatory environment to protect human creativity, because to me, that's really important. We have to always protect human creativity. It doesn't mean that AI can't generate music. It just means that we need to recognize what is made by humans and what is not. And I believe value humans more. And we need the right regulatory environments in every single African country to protect human-made creativity. And we don't have that. That's what we need to change first. And then again, if an African songwriter is using Suno to make music right now, and then it's making them happy, so be it. But the potential money that could be changing hands in that scenario, if that song became popular, is far less than it should be right now, because we have a weak regulatory environment to capitalize on it.
I guess we're having a conversation, but having to factor in some additional layers in terms of African artists navigating ownership infrastructure, but without also having that ownership of the AI rails within Africa. Do you think that is possible, or how do we navigate that with these new advents of technology?
Yeah, there are no African domiciled large language models, right? Is what you're saying. So
yeah, basically, in a very long way.
Well, there aren't any. There are very few European ones too, right? It's just America and China that own these models and control it. So I believe that's a broader geopolitical issue that the entire world that doesn't own these models is going to face. Music is just another part of that. Like, I'm hoping that in the future there will be an African LLM. That's one of the problems with AI, right? It's not designed by Africans. Yeah. Therefore, the output, will give you information based on who designed it and who fed it the information.
Yes.
So I hope that in the future we'll see technological investment in Africa so that there are African domiciled LLMs. But until then, I think it's just we have to work with what we have.
And I think we could probably have a whole podcast episode just discussing that one area, which we're not going to do today. So if we kind of fast forward, look into the future, 10 years' time, we're sitting down having this conversation. What would success for MEDI look like? And, how different could Africa's music economy realistically become?
Well, I want to establish music as a mainstream investable economic sector everywhere. Simple, right? That's my goal. What that actually means, literally, is a bunch of different things. So that is structured, regulatory policy that is supportive of music as an economy in every country, updated in a regular cycle. I truly believe that we should have a couple African markets in the top 10 of global music revenues. I think we should have a dedicated music impact fund funded by, development banks that is investing in the tracks and supporting the tracks so we get more trains, right? And I'm hoping that within 5 years, Nigeria and Kenya can close a meaningful share of the 286 million, right? And we can demonstrate that some of that money is actually staying in the country rather than leaving the country. And I'm hoping that by 2035, Nigeria is the 5th largest exporter in music, and the money actually is domiciled in or captured in Nigeria. My goal with music is like the concept of, launched in Africa, began in Africa, that becomes something aspirational, that becomes something that people want to have, right?
Yeah.
And my hope is that music helps lead that framing and support of the broader African creative industries, investments, tech, fashion, financial services, whatever. I want that built in Africa or built in X country in Africa. I want that to mean something even more. And I want that to be something that people look and go, that's a stamp of quality. That's a stamp of approval. That's a stamp of where the world is heading.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that have guided us through difficult or good moments. Is there one that's been particularly meaningful to you throughout your career?
I don't really have a quote or an African proverb or affirmation. I think the first time I went to the continent, it was before COVID, 2017, 18 or something like that. I went to Uganda and I got to go to Jinja, in the south of Uganda, which was completely different from Kampala. Kampala was everything everywhere all at once. And it was the craziest place I'd ever been. And then I go to Jinja and it's the exact opposite. And I remember walking around, just kind of exploring, and this woman invited me into her house. And she had an avocado tree, and she just kind of cracked it open and cut it and said, "Here, have some." And we just had a 10-minute chat, small talk. I don't remember about what. And I just remember coming out of that moment thinking, I want more of this. And the kindness and the humility and the humanity of someone who looks different to me, comes from a completely different culture. She just literally called me while I was walking, that stuck with me. And lastly, I remember the first time I heard Fela Kuti, who's one of my favorite artists of all time. I was 15 years old. I will never forget hearing it was Zombie, made it was the hit song, whatever. But
no.
And I never heard music like that before. And I can't quite explain what it did to me, but it did something. And I knew nothing about him, the politics and the history and all that kind of stuff. I didn't know who he was. I had just heard this song and I'm like, whoa, I didn't know music could sound like this. And that really opened up the world to me musically. And is one of the reasons why I'm doing this is just I love many, many African artists. And I've been very, very lucky to get to experience and see and meet many of them. And I truly believe that no matter where you live or what you look like, everyone should have a chance at success in this business. And I'm not going to stop until that is true everywhere.
Fantastic. And thank you for sharing that with us, Shain. That has been a great conversation and one that's close to my heart as someone who has once or did work in the music industry. So thank you for joining us today and sharing your knowledge, your skills, your experience, your vision in terms of the conversation about ownership, institutions, intellectual property, economic development. And I think one thing that you've proven is that all of that can be put together to produce world-class artists and a world-class music economy throughout the continent. And it's not just a aspiration or kind of a pie-in-the-sky idea. It's something that's definitely achievable.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Sometimes you have to fight to get music in these kinds of conversations that aren't about music or about economic development or trade. And I greatly appreciate the time. And anyone who listens to this, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcast or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.